Hey everyone, this week I'm going to be talking about and using the Tokina SZX 400mm reflex lens. So I'm back out in the Peak District again. This week I'm at Surprise View, and in a moment I'm going to take a walk up to Millstone's Edge and get some shots with this lens. It's quite an unusual one because it's 400mm, it's telephoto, quite a lot of reach, but it's quite small as well, and that's because it's a reflex lens. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and also how the lens performs and things like that when we get up top, so I'll see you up there. Okay, so here we are, up on top now, and as you can see I've got the Tokina 400mm reflex lens attached to my Z7. It is available for other mounts, including other mirrorless such as Canon and Fujifilm, etc. And as I said, this is really small considering it's a 400mm telephoto lens. This is with the lens hood on. If I take that off, you see just how small it is. And that's because it is a reflex lens. So what is a reflex lens? They're also known as catadioptric lenses, and they've been around for over a century now and originally designed for microscopes. And the thing that makes them different is that they've got mirrors inside. So normally you would have the light coming in through your lens, going right through the lens and hitting the sensor. In this lens, or in all reflex lenses, the light goes in, it bounces back off a mirror and then back again towards the center. And because it's got that extra distance to travel, that effectively increases the focal length but inside a small body. So they are really versatile, but they do have drawbacks. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later on. Right now I'm going to set up my tripod and I'm going to get some shots looking out into the valley there. It's not going to be the usual shot I would get up here because it's such a long focal length. Really, I'm just going to be picking out portions of the background you see behind me, and yeah, we'll see how those come out. Right, the light is going down fairly quickly at the moment, so I'm actually going to hand over to my future self when I'm back at home to talk about the build and the quality of the actual physical lens. So the Tokina SZX lens is not only really small for a 400mm, but at just over 350 grams it's also really light. So it could be good for people who want to do travel photography or hiking, or if you just want to pack quite light. It's got a mostly metal construction, but you do have plastic caps at either end. Inside of here you've got 6 elements in 5 groups. Tokina say that they are multi-layered coatings and anti-reflective coatings on those. And you've got this unique setup with the mirrors. You've got this little shape in the middle, behind there you've got the mirrors. And this does produce really unique donut-shaped bokeh. So some people like that, some people don't. But if you're going to be using this lens, you do have to live with it, so something to bear in mind. And you've got this big rubber grip, which is quite precise, quite smooth, but it does take a lot of rotating. I think there's probably 2 full rotations to get the full range there. So bear that in mind. It might not be that quick to focus in on your subject. It doesn't have built-in VR, but it will work with most cameras in-body stabilisation. So in the Z7, it will work with that, but because it's a non-CPU lens, i.e. when you have this attached, it doesn't communicate with the camera. Because of that, you need to go into the menu system and tell the camera that it's 400mm and it's got an aperture of f8. Then it can use the in-body stabilisation. You do get this supplied with a lens hood. The only problem is you cannot attach this to the lens, so all you can really do is just slot that over the end and it can fall off. when you take the lens cap off, you can attach this. It's got a 67mm thread, and it does screw into that thread, which is fine. However, if you want to use filters, you can't, because it uses the same thread. So that's perhaps a little bit of a design flaw. And it also means you can't put the lens cap back on. But we do have a removable mount, which I think is a fantastic idea. This is for the Z7, but you can take that off and you can purchase separately a different mount, pop that on there, and that'll work with a different mirrorless system. So I think all third-party lenses should be doing this. If you decide to swap systems and you don't want to buy an entire new lens, you can just buy the new mount and you're good to go. But right now we'll talk about the performance and the handling. And I have to say it's quite difficult to get focus at 400mm. This is a manual focus lens. That is a feature of reflex lenses in general. And it is a fixed aperture of f8. So it does take a little bit of getting used to. And to try and get around some of the problems with focusing, I'm using focus peaking, and also I'm using magnification to zoom in on my subject to really look at those pixels in fine detail. So for focus peaking, you can turn this on in your menu settings. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but most cameras have it these days. And when you focus manually on your subject, certain areas of your screen will then illuminate in a colour that you've chosen. So right now you can see here in this little area of the river, there's some little bits of red starting to appear, some red pixels, and that means that that area is in focus. The other method is to zoom in with the magnification buttons on the back, and then you can actually get a real close look at the area that you want to focus on and make sure that that's in focus, like that, and then get your shot. So because of that fixed f8 aperture, you do really have to think about the light when you're using this lens. If it's too dark, you're going to struggle to get enough light into the camera. For one thing, that does mean that your viewfinder is quite dark because not enough light's getting in to illuminate the viewfinder. And two, obviously you're going to have to bump up your ISO to get a good exposure and things. And if you've got too much light, you're going to struggle with this because you can't actually stop down the aperture. So you're going to have to use an ND filter or something like that to stop the light coming into the camera. The minimum focusing distance of this lens is 1.15 meters, so you can use this for macro if you want, and it does have indicators on the lens barrel to show you where you would focus for those macro focal distances. Okay, so I've got a few images now. I'm going to head home, we'll get those on the computer and we'll have a look at the image quality. I'll see you back there. Okay, so we can take a look at this one first. This one was captured around about the beginning of golden hour, so the light is fairly good. But even with that, we're at ISO 1600, and that's because of the constant f8 aperture. We can't open that up anymore to let any more light in, and I did want to maintain a shutter speed of over 1/400th of a second. If we zoom in, we can see there is some softness around these buildings, but we do have to bear in mind that this was taken from a very, very long distance, and it is also difficult, like I said, to get the manual focus right, so it's hard to judge from these images just how sharp the lens is. If we take a look at this image instead, this one is an image of Otis, just taken from an upstairs window from about 15 meters, and we can see we've got much more clarity and sharpness here. So that is something to bear in mind when doing landscape photography with such a long focal length. You have to factor in things like the distance of the objects, the size of the object, and also atmospheric haze and things. The longer the distance between you and the subject, you are going to get atmospheric factors, reducing contrast and also sharpness and clarity. We can see, if I just turn off the edits here, we do have a slight lack of contrast with this lens, but it is easy to inject some of that with Lightroom or Photoshop or your editor of choice. And I've just put a little bit of sharpening on here, and it's not looking too bad at all for a budget lens. As the light started to drop, I really did have to bump up my ISO. If we take a look at this one, I'm at ISO 2500, and I've not even managed to get 1/400th of a second shutter speed. So as I've mentioned before in previous videos, it is best if you can to try and keep your denominator, i.e. the bottom number here in your shutter speed, at least equal to your focal length. So ideally I was looking for 1/400th of a second, but I didn't really want to go too high with my ISO. If I look at the original image here without any edits, you can see there's quite a lot of noise in there. So I compromised a little bit. I was at 1/200th of a second, ISO 2500. But the good thing is, with modern software, you can remove a lot of that noise. So we see here, it's a lot smoother, a lot cleaner. I've added a little bit of sharpening, obviously some contrast, bringing out some detail in the shadows, etc. And you do have to remember that this is so far away. This chimney here belongs to the cement works, which is over 5 miles away from where I was taking this shot. All things considered, this is not bad image quality at all. There is some natural vignetting from this lens. I don't know if you can see it here in the original, perhaps if I just bump up the contrast. In the corners we've got a much darker area there. And I do like to add a vignette myself in most of my images, but it is nice to have control over that and not have the vignette by default in the actual image. And another problem I found, that if I was shooting directly into the sun, I did get this really bad flaring effect, which made the images almost unusable. Unless you're wanting to go for a very particular creative effect, this is the kind of thing that I was getting. So even though this has supposedly got some multi-layer coatings to try and reduce flare and glare, it's not quite working when you're shooting directly into really strong light sources. So the Tokina SZX 400mm f8 reflex lens is by no means a perfect lens. You are going to have to accept some compromises when using this, such as the f8 aperture, manual focus only, non-CPU lens, and it's not the sharpest lens in the world. However, on the other hand, it is probably sharper than you would expect for a reflex lens. It's really small, really light, and really fun to use. You do have some issues with the lens hood not being able to be attached at the same time as filters and things like that. But then again, on the other hand, it does have the interchangeable mount system, which I think is a really good idea. But perhaps the best thing about this lens is the price. You can pick this up in the UK for around about £200 to £250 brand new, which is not insignificant, but when you compare it to the price of a regular 400mm lens, that's absolutely nothing. So for that alone, it's worth picking up and throwing in your bag for when you need that extra reach. It's really good, as I said, for people who want to do travel photography or a day hike or want to pack light. I don't think it's going to be that much use for wildlife photographers, perhaps for stationary birds or that kind of thing, but for anything with erratic movement, I think you're going to struggle because of the manual focus only and because it's got the constant f8 aperture, and you're going to struggle getting enough light into the camera with really high shutter speeds. But all of those quirks aside, it's really good. I will be keeping hold of it. I'll be throwing it in my bag and using it from time to time, so yeah, check it out. So that's it for this video. A huge thanks for watching again, and as always, I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. If you are new to the channel and you're not yet subscribed and you'd like to do so, you can just click down there on the big red button. You know how it works. That way you'll stay up to date with everything I'm doing each and every week. There's a new video every Sunday morning at 10 AM UK time. So sometimes I'm doing lens reviews like this, other times it's wildlife, it can be macro, it could be street photography. I do a wide range. But I do hope you'll catch me for the next one, and until then, thanks a lot everyone, and bye for now.